Great. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar series. We typically do this on Webinar Wednesday, but obviously today we're doing it on Thursday due to some scheduling issues. This is going to be about phase 3 updates and reopening here in North Carolina. We had some pretty big news happening with the governor's executive order last week, and we're just going to kind of bounce through that. Before we get started, though, I want to give a huge thank you for support from our sponsors, not only of Arts Day coming up, but really our sponsors for the work that we do all year. We owe them a tremendous debt of gratitude. You can always check out who our sponsors are at our website at artsnc.org. They are basically on every single page of the website. So today I want to kind of going to talk a little bit about how Arts North Carolina has been involved in the reopening process, starting back with phase 2 and 2.5 and into phase 3, kind of review the executive order and what it says, and go over a few of the things that are required for everybody as well as for each specific venue. I'm also hopeful that when we get to the end, to the sort of the question period, that we might have some conversation. I don't have all the answers, but I know that I've got a lot of talented arts leaders on the calls or on the webinar today. So maybe we can have a chat and we're going to figure some things out together. So let's go ahead and get started. Oh, please do put questions in the Q&A box, and Christine is monitoring that, and we'll shout them out throughout the presentation, or we'll have more of that discussion towards the end. So Arts North Carolina has really been involved in having these conversations around reopening since phase 2 came out way back in May. There were a lot of questions when it first came out, and Arts North Carolina sort of took that up and said, you know, we really need to be trying to have a conversation directly with the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the governor's office, to clarify some things. Because right out of the gate, there were some confusions, particularly around summer day camps and museum facilities and some other issues that were coming up around phase 2. Once we sort of got through those big questions, we realized that museums were left out. Kind of inexplicably, whereas you know, shopping malls and the Gap were open at 50%, but art museums, which are these, you know, usually these very large, well aerated, spacious facilities, were completely closed. So we had that conversation with both the governor's office and DHHS. We worked with some museum leaders, particularly the Asheville Art Museum up there in Asheville, North Carolina, joined with a bunch of museum leaders to contribute to a letter to both Secretary Cohen and Governor Cooper, and just sort of did everything that we could to help position museums to be able to open in phase 2.5, which we were successful in. Museums were open at basically at 50% capacity starting in early September of 2020. Then, you know, about a month later in October, I think it was late September, early October, the governor rolled out with Executive Order 169, I think it was, which started phase 3. And there was a lot of confusion because they limited movie theaters to 100 and live performance venues to 25. But in the press conference, they only talked about movie theaters, and there was a lot of confusion going on. So we reached out and made sure that we had that communication directly with DHHS in that 48-hour period before folks started opening shows, and so that there would be some sort of clarity across for the entire field. And then, you know, we continue to have those conversations, particularly around phase 3, because there was a lot of issues of, well, what if it's a performing arts center and not a movie theater, but you're showing a movie? So we had to clarify and work out with them that it was dependent upon the activity that you were doing during phase 3. So if you were a performing arts center showing a movie, you could have 100 people. If you were doing a bluegrass band, then you could only have 25. So kind of working to clarify. But also, you know, in dealing with phase 3, we were also trying to create a plan really since October to move the arts forward through the reopening process. One of the things we wanted to have was a plan with some benchmarks, right? So we had 30%, but it was capped at 100 people outside and 25 people inside. So we knew that wasn't going to be sustainable for any real shows, right? Like not many actual performances were happening given that capacity cap. So as we started saying, it's like maybe, so we started putting forward these requests like, can we have a plan? Perhaps the first benchmark could be 30% with either a much higher cap or no cap at all, right? Talking to them about the fact that, 30% with 6-foot distancing, you're not going to be able to move much past 30% anyway. So that 30% would be a safe place to start. And then perhaps moving to 50% with loosening restrictions more to the outdoors venues, which obviously are going to be safer because they're pretty well ventilated, and then indoor venues as we go, and maybe that timeline looks to opening. These are just suggestions that we're making, trying to start that conversation and to suggest a framework that we might see over time with the as DHHS and the governor's office work through this. We did request clear guidance about live performance, right? Like what is reasonable and some clearly defined requirements and recommendations for the live performance industry. Different states are approaching this different ways and kind of showing our administration some of the things that are happening in the sector in other states has been part of the conversation that we've had to basically said, give us some guidance on how you want us to move forward. And, and this was a real point specifically first with museums in phase 2, and then again with movies, theaters, and event spaces versus performing arts theaters, is that we really felt like in order to be successful with the reopening, that the government really needed to treat venues much more equally, which, I think we made some huge strides with that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The two government agencies that we have been engaging with have been the Department of Health and Human Services and the Legal Counsel's Office with Governor Cooper's office. We have not been engaging with the General Assembly. I'm sure that you have seen certain bills come up for reopening schools or reopening high school sports or these things come up. None of these reopening bills in the last year have actually led to reopening. So we've decided to keep our advocacy and our conversation directly with the DHHS and the governor's office, as they are the ones that are directly making decisions, and then we want to have that advocacy with. We had some amazing partners along the way here. The North Carolina Theater Conference and the North Carolina Presenters Consortium, of course, have always been great partners when we were talking about live performance venues. So it's the easiest way for us to kind of connect to that entire field. We've been working with the North Carolina Independent Venue Alliance, which is an organization that really didn't exist a year ago. It's a collection of about 32 to 35 independently owned venues. I think there's a comedy club, but mostly music venues all across the state. That actually allowed us to sort of open up our sphere and understand some of the issues that those types of venues were having that weren't specifically performing arts centers like what we would think of. And then of course we work closely with the North Carolina Arts Council as as the government agency that obviously is very well versed in live performance and having those conversations. So the big news was that last week on Friday, Executive Order 195 went into effect, which eased a wide variety of restrictions on the arts. The two big wins here is that those advocacy objectives that we've been working on for months, we saw two of them really come through. They safely raised limits. We went from 25 cap indoors to a 250 cap indoors, which was huge. On outdoors, the cap was completely removed. We're now at a flat 30%. It was exactly what we were looking for. It was done safely. It was done considering the science. It was done, making points to them that, just because if you make an announcement on Wednesday, you're not going to have live events happening all over the place on Friday. It takes time to book. It takes time for us to gear up, helping them to understand our industry. And so we're starting to see that reflected in the results. And really, and maybe even more importantly, is that we're seeing equal treatment across everything: bars, sports, movies, event spaces, weddings, theaters, music halls. everything is being treated equitably and kind of equally, with a few variations in between venues. So it's not a one size fits all, but we're seeing much more along the lines of the arts, or performing arts and live performance, are not being pigeonholed into something that's considered more dangerous. And I think that's going to be key as we move forward. So as you all know, 5 o'clock this past Friday, everything in Executive Order 195 took effect. One of the main things is the curfew has been lifted. We had a curfew in place that you had to be closed and heading home by 10 o'clock every night, and couldn't go out until 5 a.m. the next morning. That curfew has been lifted. Also, alcohol can now be sold up until 11 p.m. So a little bit of a stretch of that alcohol cutoff, and bars are now open and can be open indoors, and they're also being treated equitably with the 30% capacity indoors at 250 people, with the 30% capacity for their outdoor spaces. So that's where we're starting to see that equity move even into spheres that aren't necessarily the performing arts. And now this is one I want to mention, and this has tripped a lot of people up. The mass gathering limit, right? We hear a lot about that mass gathering limit. The size limit, this is really for social gatherings or other gatherings that are not specifically handled in Executive Order 195, particularly Section 3, which I'll explain in a minute. And what this particular order did, we had a indoor mass gathering limit of 10. That has now been raised to 25. We had that outdoor mass gathering limit at 50. It is staying at 50. This is for family picnics, right? Like this was for Super Bowl parties. This is for Sunday dinners. This is not for your venue. So understand that distinction, because I know that there's a misconception out there, particularly with a lot of folks that aren't looking right at this. Yes.
We have a question about that, actually.
Okay.
And somebody was asking about festivals and events that are conducted within outdoor public spaces, as in streets and parks, those types of festivals. Are those types of performances limited by the mass gathering minimum? It seems to this person that they are.
So a festival that is happening, I think that you're going to have to look at the capacity of the space, right? So if as to determine whether or not your festival space is being considered as a outdoor venue or a large outdoor venue, and how you're going to manage that. Regardless, I think that if you set up your space to function as a venue and have strict controls about how many people are allowed in that venue, and we're going to get into this a little bit, make sure everybody's got space to space 6 feet apart, and that's being followed, that a festival could be considered at a 30% cap. But you have to, there's a mathematical calculation. I believe it's 7 people for every 1,000 square feet. So if you don't have an existing venue that has an capacity, then you got to do that calculation, and that becomes your capacity. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And if there's questions, I can always address that specific question by email as well.
We've actually got another questions about these mass gathering limits. They seem to be causing some confusion.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've been asked about, do they affect rehearsals or say business meetings? It sounds like to these people like that might be a limit for the mass gathering.
Right. So with a business meeting, I would say yes. It definitely does set a limit on the mass gathering. I would say in terms of rehearsals, that's a good question, right? Because the gathering limits for a theater, say if you're doing a dance production, you can put up to 250 people in the theater and not have those performers count. So there's no limit on how many staff and performers. So theoretically, if they were rehearsing, it would be a different type of limit, or they shouldn't technically have a limit. But I would say that if you are rehearsing in a space that is not a performing arts center, that is just like a regular room, that you would want to maybe consider those mass gathering limits to apply to you. You don't want, and the thing is that with all of the limits that we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to get into this in more detail, they're going to be capped versus they're going to also be capped. This is important, also be capped at what you can do while allowing 6-foot distancing between groups. And I'll get into a little bit more details, and if there's more questions, we can come back to that. So kind of the good thing about Executive Order 195, this is the third sort of long executive order that we have seen within phase 3. You had 169, which established it, and then 181 that sort of updated everything on where we was. It's always got the same, we always pop into the same section, right? So once you know your section, you can go right there. Section 1 is always going to be like a definition of what they mean by ... right? Like, what is a face covering? What is an amusement park, right? Like, how is the law defining some of these key terms? Section 2 is always going to be talking about face coverings. Section 3, this is the business section, right? And so it is going to cover a wide variety of different types of businesses. One of the biggest confusions when this first came out with Executive Order 169 is that performing arts centers are listed under bars, night spots, and arenas. So if you were only scanning the titles, you would not probably have thought that a performing arts center would have been a bar, a night spot, or an arena. But that's kind of so that's the title, but that's for our purposes, it's really 3.2 is the indoor and outdoor performance venues. In addition to that, dance studios are in 3.5, though their title is fitness and physical activity facilities. So we can see how dance studios fall into that. Another one kind of important to the arts is movie theaters, meeting spaces, and entertainment facilities. This is conference centers, meeting spaces, as well as movie theaters. So if we're talking about business meetings in like a space that's designed for meetings, like a conference room, then you would be looking at 3.8 to backtrack to that other question. 3.9, museums and aquariums. Obviously, art museums fall under that. I'm not going to talk really at all today about restaurants and retail businesses. However, if you are a museum or a facility that has a restaurant or a retail business within your museum, say, you do need to go and check out the guidelines for restaurants and retail businesses. Section 4, overnight restrictions, not exclusively to the arts, but things you might want to check in there about alcohol sales or curfews. That's always going to pop up in Section 4. Section 5, again, mass gathering limit. And it very specifically says in Section 5 that the mass gathering limit is only for those activities not covered in Section 3, which is 3.2, 3.8, 3.5, etc. And then Section 6 is going to be the additional provisions for the larger venues, right? And a lot of the news stories that we see out will kind of focus on those larger venues and maybe confuse the issue. We're going to get a little bit more into that, but the larger venues are really functioning with the same rules, only with a few extra rules to make sure that they're operating a little extra safe, since we're talking about larger capacities. So indoor and outdoor venues, I know this is probably what most of the folks on the call fall into. You can allow up to 30% of your stated fire capacity or 250 guests, whichever is less, right? So that's your cap. So whatever your fire capacity is for your room, 30% of that or 250 guests, whichever is less. You're going to see links to all of the guidance here, because every single one of these businesses has a 4 to 5 page sheet that really goes into detail. And if you're running a theater, I strongly encourage you to print them, keep it in your back pocket, right? Like, this is your guide, and it's going to be a good check box. So use that guidance for sure. Outdoor venues with a capacity less than 10,000. 30% of your stated fire capacity, not including staff and performers, right? And that's really across the board on all of these, or on all of the performance venues. Staff and performers do not count towards your capacity restrictions. And really that 30% rule, that's for all outdoor venues, though we'll talk a little more in a bit about what the extra rules are for the larger venues. So now here's the important thing, and you're going to see this pop up a lot. In addition to those capacity limits that we just talked about, all indoor and outdoor venues must limit the number of guests or your audience so that groups can stay 6 feet apart, right? or if you've got counter or table seating, that you need to be able to seat groups 6 feet apart. And that you need to be ensure that your performers are staying at least 6 feet apart from your guests, right? So you have to also limit your capacity by the number of guests. That's in addition to that 250. So, so you have to be mindful of that as you move forward. For the purposes of this part of the executive order, a group is any group of people that live in the same household. Now, granted, you don't have to check all their driver's licenses. If they show up together and they are obviously a group, then you can consider them a group, right? Like we don't have to, and generally that's going to be folks that have bought tickets together and are identifying as a group. You're going to seat them together, and then you have to keep them 6 feet apart from any other group. The other thing, and this is going to be for a wide variety of things, but you've got to keep your guests seated. With the exception of entering and exiting the building, obviously, using amenities or the restroom, or getting up to obtain food or drink. But apart from these very specific things, they really have to remain seated. You cannot have standing room only shows. You can't have a dance floor area. That you've got to keep everybody in their seats. And also there's a lot of recommendations about, you also want to try and keep people separated 6 feet apart when they are doing these activities like entering and exiting or obtaining food or drink, so that they are staying 6 feet apart and socially distanced, whether or not that means longer intermissions or no intermissions, or letting people into the building to take their seat in sections. There's lots of ways that you can go about that, but you want to try and keep people 6 feet apart. And now this one is pretty clear. All workers must wear masks, and all guests must wear masks unless they are actively drinking or eating. Now, that's what the law says, or that is what the executive order says, excuse me. There is not a mask exception for performers, though there is under the mask, that's section 2 about the mask, there are exceptions for things like strenuous exercise. And I think that certain forms of dance could be considered strenuous exercise, though obviously if it is possible for all your dancers to be wearing a mask, then that's going to be the best way forward. I do want to talk a little bit, because this is actually the one question that I have received that I have not gotten an answer from DHHS about, and I want to talk a little bit about how we think about that. And because I know we have all seen these pictures of performances happening in bubbles, right? So, and everybody's like, well, what about performers? How can I sing with a mask? How can I do this? How can I dance? I think that we all know what the intent of the rule is, right? I don't think that if Secretary Cohen walked in on any one of these performances and that you're looking at right now, and saw that the audience was following the rules, technically these folks in their plastic bubbles are breaking the rules because they are not wearing a face covering. But there is an obvious effort here that has been made to keep these performers from spreading COVID-19, right? So they are not following the exact letter of, according to Hoyle rule of the executive order. But I think we can see that there is a reasonable effort, actually maybe a beyond reasonable effort, to follow the intent. So and I was thinking about this today, like, how do we want to approach these rules? It's like if you're getting into a fight, like two little kids are getting into a fight, and the mom says, don't touch your brother, and then you get up in him and be like, I'm not touching you, but you're really annoying them and getting all up in your face. You don't want to be that guy, right? Don't look for loopholes. What you want to do is make sure that whatever you're trying to do with your performance, you're being thoughtful and you're trying to follow the intent, which is doing everything possible to minimize the spread. So no, I don't think that there's a really effective way to put 30 people on stage and do a musical production and somehow not have masks, right? Unless your stage is the size of a football field, that you're not going to be following the intent of the rule, right? But maybe if you had a music act where where the singer's not wearing a mask but is encased in plexiglass or some other way to kind of and all of the other musicians might be separated by more than 6 feet, 10, 20 feet, right? Like go the extra mile if you're questioning whether or not something is able, or just tell everybody to perform in masks, because that's the way to follow the rule, is that everybody, according to the letter of the executive order, should be wearing masks. I honestly don't think that DHHS wants to come up with a rule on this, because as soon as they do, there's going to be a question, and as soon as they answer that question, there's going to be another question, because there's going to be we're all going to be trying to come up with 500 different ways to do this. I think that really what we have to do as when we approach performers, we're really looking at all these rules is, what is the reasonable expectation? Am I doing everything up to reasonable or beyond reasonable to mitigate the spread of COVID-19?
We have a few questions before you move on.
I thought there might be when I put a slide up about bubbles.
And so here's something for people to kind of write in the chat. If you're a venue owner, somebody asked, what kind of language are venues planning to use in their ticketing systems to ensure that bulk ticket purchases are members of the same household? And if you know anything about that, Nate, in terms of what the rule is, but that's something for you venue owners to go ahead and type in the chat if you figured that out, how to do that.
Right, and I would say that you are as a business owner and a business operator, you are only going to be able to control people's behavior to a certain extent, right? I think you have to make that there's a reasonable if a group of people that doesn't live in the same household bought tickets together and wants to sit together, right? Odds are they've already been around each other without a mask on, right? So you don't necessarily need to go and try and prove something, right? Like don't overthink it, right? I think that that you can post something on your website and you can say, we ask, we are as per the governor's order, people who live in the same household can buy groups of tickets together. So please, if you are buying groups of tickets together, everybody in that group should be from the same household. And I think at that point, you've probably covered any liability that you have. And I also let's also not be really afraid that there is going to be a massive amount of liability about whether or not you sat two people that don't live in the same household, right? There's no reasonable expectation that you would be able to have that information, particularly if folks have seen that posted on your website and have bought those tickets together. So I think that, just some understanding. So just kind of think through, like, how are you going to make the statement that this is the way this system is supposed to work, and then expect everybody to be on their best behavior.
Okay, we've got some other ones. Saying our theater is rented out for weddings and receptions. Currently, we can only have weddings, but not receptions. Has that changed? And what section is that covered in?
Okay, so weddings and receptions are going to be coming up after this one, and meetings. So I'll talk a little. I'll make sure to cover that a little bit.
And then there's some other questions about the sections. Who's covered in what section? An indoor theater with 99 seats. Would that be section 3.2?
Yes, that is section 3.2.
And then there's also a question about retail galleries. They would be considered retail businesses, yes?
A gallery is a retail, and a museum is a museum, and they are treated very much the same now but they weren't in the beginning. But galleries have always been considered retail. If you walk into a place and can buy what's on the walls, then that is a retail establishment.
Okay, one more.
Okay.
It says, prior to the order, I was told there was a mask exception for a private event. Example, a live event with performers on stage for broadcast, but it is closed to the public. Has that changed?
I would say that, yes, there were some rules around broadcast in the very beginning. I would say that if you are doing rules for broadcast, if you are removing masks for broadcast, I would look that up, and I can maybe handle that offline, because I'm sort of focusing on live performance. There were rules for broadcast that allowed you to have whatever the mass gathering limit was. It was you could not use masks, but it is strongly recommended, if not required, for there to be testing or living in a bubble. And if you're going to do that, you should be going out of your way to take all those extra steps. A lot of those that are outlined in professional guidance for filming that both IATSE's put out and some other TV producers, TV organizations. And those we do have links to those on the open arts section of artsnc.org that can go more into detail about, you know, creating pods and different levels of testing for different zones.
Okay, let's move on.
All right, so so indoor venues over 5,000. So, you know, obviously we're talking about the big arenas. They don't have the 250 cap, but it's 15%, not 30%. So once you cross that 5,000, you've got to stay at 15%. And there is a separate set of guidance for large indoor and outdoor venues. What's a large outdoor venue? That's the outdoor venues with capacity over 10,000, right? We're talking about big football stadiums. So it is 30% for so outdoor venues is the same. It's 30% for outdoor venues, regardless. You do have to follow all of the restrictions in 3.2 for smaller indoor and outdoor venues, except of course for the 250 cap. But you've got to do a little extra, right? So if you're one of the big boys, you got to do a few things extra to make absolutely sure that you're keeping everybody 6 feet apart. One is that all your seating in large venues has to be ticketed, and it has to space groups 6 feet apart. And they specifically define groups here as those that have bought tickets and arrived together, right? So outside of that living together area, but anybody that buys tickets and arrive together. Also, you got to make sure you're maintaining 6 feet between groups both horizontally and vertically. Horizontally meaning space of groups in the same row, vertically meaning space between rows. So you might have to have a gap of at least one row, if not more, to keep that 6 foot distancing. You also have to have a staff directing and monitoring the flow of guests to ensure that they're staying 6 feet apart in the concession area, that they're you know, making sure that you've got all that taped out. And we'll get to that in the end about you know, taping out your 6 feet apart. That as people are entering the exit of the building, that they're not just getting in the gate and then whipping their mask off, right? So you've got to staff up and you've got to make sure that people are following the flow plan. And actually that's another thing that you're required, is that you actually have to sit down and draw out a flow plan, right? That entails both time and space, like when are people going to be busiest, when are they going to be going for beer, when are they going to be doing this, how are we going to make this work, how do we keep this group of people moving in one direction and this group of people moving in the other direction, right? So you've got to sit down and come up with that plan. There are some resources there for creating flow plans. I know most venues probably at this point have come up with some sort of flow plan, but you're required by law, by the executive order, to do that if you're a larger venue. I don't want to spend too much time on larger venues because I'm not sure how many folks we've got dealing with stadiums. The movie theater and event spaces. So just like theaters, you can have 30%, you're capped at 250, whichever is less. Whether or not you're showing a movie or for conferences and events. So this is kind of getting into this wedding question, right? So movie theaters are pretty obvious. You know, we got to seat people 6 feet apart. Again, just like the wording for movie theaters and event spaces in the executive order is exactly the same as it was for the 3.2, those indoor and outdoor venues, is that groups need to stay 6 feet apart, group being defined as folks from a household. That table seating needs to be kept 6 feet apart. Performers have to stay at least 6 feet away. So yes, your wedding band has to stay away from your guests. You have to remain seated except for food and drink and using the amenities, entering and exit, et cetera. So you can have a wedding, everyone's got to be seated. You can have a reception, but it's got to be a sit-down reception, not a get up and moving around reception. Again, all workers and guests must wear masks indoors. Now it's a little different here, and we're going to see this pop up in museums. Everybody's got to wear masks indoors. I think in this, if people are eating, it doesn't say it specifically, but you get a pass on actively, with the key word being actively eating and drinking. When people are outdoors, workers and guests must wear masks if they are within 6 feet of someone who does not reside in the same household. So there's a little flexibility on the rules when you're outside for an event, right? Not for a live performance event, but say for a wedding. If you step outside, for a cigarette or just to get some air, you can take your mask off, but you've got to stay 6 feet or more away. So there's a little flexibility with that outside, but that's only for events and movie theaters. That is not for outdoor venues, to be very clear. And with these gatherings, just like at your wedding, you cannot have events where they're standing, so no mix and mingle receptions. You cannot have dancing, and it is not because we hate dancing. This is not Footloose. There is no Kevin Bacon. It is simply because dancing, people getting close, this is obviously going to be a lead in for a super spreader event. So we are banning dancing at weddings and mix and mingle stand together. So museums have had some easing in their restrictions as well, though they were already at 50% capacity. They're still at 50% of their stated capacity. Museums used to, up until last week, had to keep no more than 25 folks in each room, no matter the size of the room. There was a cap at 25 people. That is now been removed. Now it's simply 50% of stated capacity for any rooms, and using the same guidance, obviously, as museums and aquariums. You do have to ensure guests are able to and remain 6 feet away from groups other than their households. Change the wording a little bit here, not limit capacity for 6 feet, but that people are able to. So there has to be some sort of monitoring about that. Also, in museums, and they mention these things very specifically under museums and aquariums that they might not mention other places, because everybody really should be posting signing about social distancing, but they actually put it under museums that you should be posting signage about everybody staying 6 feet apart, and requesting that anybody that's symptomatic with anything, fever, cough, etc., just stay out of the building, right? Like you can refuse entry to someone who is coughing. That is okay. That is within your rights. And again, same indoor outdoor that we had before. All workers and guests inside wearing masks at all time. When we're outdoors, you can take the mask off as long as you are 6 feet away outside from someone in the same household. Also, and this is specifically mentioned in the under museums, but also is something that's really required for everybody, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, is conducting daily symptom screenings for workers using an interview questionnaire. I think the temperature checks are great. They're not in the requirement for the temperature check, but it really is just before anybody's entering that building, really for everybody. I mean, and this is for all of your workers and guests from all of your workers, everybody that's showing up to your place of business on a regular basis needs to be answering these questions. And if they go, oh, you know what, I actually, was sneezing a lot an hour ago, maybe then turn them away. Or if they're sick, to have a plan to isolate them. Touching on dance studios real quick, they actually saw relaxing as well. They were at 30%. We're now up to 50% of stated fire capacity. However, again, we have to limit capacity to make sure that you're allowing space for individual folks to be able to stay 6 feet apart in the dance studio. So that's something that you do. You can't just put 50% of it, but if you're still banging into each other, folks need to have the ability to stay 6 feet apart during the dance workshop. All workers and guests, masks indoors at all times. This is the same kind of rule that we had for museums, as well as movie theaters. Again, strenuous exercise can be an exception to the requirement, though certainly I myself and Arts North Carolina is to wear a mask whenever possible, right? We know the science is known. The best way to keep this happening, or to keep COVID-19 from spreading, is to keep the mask on. You don't have to allow your dancers to take their mask off. If you own a business, you own the dance studio, if you say masks on and that is the rule, then masks on and that is the rule. You can deny someone entry if they're refusing to wear a mask, even if it's for strenuous exercise. Though certainly if it's for a medical condition, you want to take that into account. Dancers should be spaced at least 6 feet apart. This is just generally good guidance as you're doing groups and classes. I think you get a little bit more flexibility with this if everybody's wearing a mask, right? Another reason, right? Dancers might get closer together, but if they're wearing masks, it might not be as much of an issue. Instructors are allowed to break that 6-foot bubble, but for no more than 15 minutes. This is more for workout instructors. I think dance classes, most corrections take much less than 15 minutes with any dance student. All equipment should be disaffected between each use. In a gym, this means, you know, the treadmill. In a dance studio, this is going to mean dance bars. So, and also your waiting areas. In really any facility with a waiting area, I think this is important. You make sure that you're allowing for social distancing, that everybody can be 6 feet apart, and that your seating areas allow for folks to be 6 feet apart in those dance studios. So, so here's the thing, and I can't stress this enough, and this is why I put it right at the top. Check out the guidance. That link right there, the slides are available on the website. That'll take you to the listing of all the guidance. They get them updated every time they come up with one of these big ones. Like last week, museums weren't up to date. I emailed them. They updated the museums one to make sure that it reflected the executive order. Check the guidance. Like I said, 4 to 5 pages. It's got things that you are required to do. It's got things that you are recommended to do. Do everything you're required and do everything you can to do the things that are recommended, because you know they're all just about operating safely. So you want to do as much of that as you can for the good of your patron. Obviously, clearly provide 6-foot marking, particularly where folks are congregating, waiting for lines of concession, waiting for lines of entrance. You know, we've all gotten very used to looking for the markings on the ground and keeping that 6-foot distance. Make sure that you've got emergency capacity signs, right? Like you've got a new capacity now that you're in COVID-19 that is 30% or 30% capped at 250, whatever that is. That should be at every single entrance of your facility so people are aware of it. Make sure you've got signs really at the main entrance and other places as much as you can, emphasizing staying 6 feet apart, wearing a face covering, and washing your hands frequently, right? Wear, wait, wash. We all know this. We've seen the signs all over the state. Make sure that you're putting them up any place, all over your venue to be in compliance. You got to promote frequent use of hand washing and hand sanitizer, reminding folks, doing whatever you can, provide an alcohol-based hand sanitizer with a minimum of 60% alcohol. This is a requirement. And you know, particularly if you're inviting 250 people into a space, you know, 1 or 2 hand sanitizer stations might not be enough, or maybe they will if they're in the right place. But making sure that they are checked regularly and refilled, you know, particularly when you're at your busiest times. Obviously, frequent cleaning, right? Make it routine. Put it on a schedule. Disinfecting all the high touch areas, doorknobs, really anything with a door, handles, stairs, stairwell railings, things of this nature. And when it's busier, increase, you know, how much you're cleaning, right? Like it's pretty common sense stuff, but these are things that common sense is required in this case. And again, daily symptom screenings, just like we were talking about in museums, getting those questionnaires, again, downloadable from that DHHS guidance, for some sample questionnaires, and just making sure that all of your employees do that. There's a more detail that you can find in those DHHS requirements. But at this point, I'll open it up for any questions.
Okay, the question I have here is about performers. Do performers need to stay 6 feet apart? For instance, musicians in an orchestra.
So I would say that yes. In general, if the musicians are not a part of the same household, that you should be doing everything possible to keep them 6 feet apart. Obviously, they should all be wearing masks. There is, depending on the instrument, you should be taking mitigation measures around that, right? So I've seen all sorts of things. There's bags that you play an oboe in. There's masks with slits in them so that when they're not playing, they can Velcro it shut. There's like, do that, right? Like as much as you can mitigate, particularly wind instruments, they should be spaced out from people. They should have caps over the bells. There's lots of products out there. I encourage you to look into them. Singing masks, for instance, they make everybody look like ducks, but it keeps the mask out away from your face. So if you can mic that well and make that work, it's not back to normal, but doing the best that we can possibly. I think also it's a good idea to choose your performances, right? So yeah, maybe you get 2 chairs that are 4 feet apart as opposed to 6 feet apart, and everybody's wearing masks and it's violin, so it's not like there's spit going everywhere. But so like, understand that that's okay, right? We're all trying really hard to make this work, but at the same time, you know that those 2 violinists shouldn't be right next to each other either. So make your best efforts. I think it's you know, we know how to do this safely. And so we just have to make our plans to as closely align with all of the safety precautions as we can to mitigate the spread. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, we've got a couple more about performances. When a person says, when I see the governor speak publicly, he removes his mask to talk. Doesn't that seem to indicate that the speakers or performers can remove their masks if they are socially distanced or part of the same household?
I would wholeheartly agree with that. Now you would, and I think that is a fantastic point. When somebody is public speaking, you know, the governor wears his mask right up there, and then as he leaves, he puts it back on and walks away, and then Secretary Cohen comes up with her mask on, so while they're passing, their mask, and then so there's a broad distance of probably easily 10, 15 feet between the governor and anybody else. The other thing to keep in mind is that the governor is speaking in a normal voice into a microphone, right? So there's a reasonable expectation that his particulate matter is only going within a 6-foot sphere. If you have got a punk rock band and that singer is screaming into the microphone at the top of their lungs, right, that particulate matter is coming out of their mouth and nose with considerably more force than the governor answering questions, particularly our governor, because he's got a very even keel speaking tone. So I would say to keep that in mind, right? Like, situation matters, context matters. The how much you're how much you're speaking should really play into your consideration, right? Remember, a person standing in the middle of a football field with an audience up in the bleachers is technically should be wearing a mask according to the rules, but obviously there's no real danger. So I think a speaker, there is a reasonable estimation that as long as you're keeping more than 6 feet of distance, that would be fine. And also sometimes you'll see they'll come out at certain speaking events and there'll be a wiper, right? Someone that just hits that podium with a disinfectant cloth. That might be a step. I don't think the governor does it anymore because it's just a small group of people, but that's something else to consider is sanitizing the area as you turn over speakers.
And here's another interesting question. If performers are all vaccinated, do they still have to be spaced 6 feet apart?
So I would say that you need, that we're going to get to a place where we're going to have conversations about vaccinated population versus non-vaccinated populations, but we are not there yet. And that's me talking, not the governor talking. The rules have to be set for everyone to follow. Because there has to be a reasonable expectation that everybody out there, you have to assume, particularly right now when only 10% of the population is vaccinated, that everybody you come across is not vaccinated. And that we all have to behave in that way, and that we all should be wearing masks. If you saw somebody not wearing a mask in a public setting, do you assume that that person is vaccinated, or do you assume that that person should probably be wearing a mask, right? So we should all be following the rules regardless of our vaccination status. There may come a time, like I said, there may come a time where we're having a conversation about people who are vaccinated can do certain things that non-vaccinated people cannot. But in this moment, under this executive order, I don't think we're there yet.
And here's kind of a related question. And this kind of gets to the guidelines for filming that you talked about before. If actors have self-quarantined prior to travel to contracted theater, can they be housed together? And if so, can they also be allowed to be on stage together without masks?
So I would say that within the executive order, that there is not, at least the sections that I've read, there's not a particular caveat at this moment for that. However, I know that that is happening nationally. I have not heard of any bans of that sort of thing happening. So I would say that if you are committing to, and I'm trying to remember the name of the guidance, but there's some very specific guidance that has come out around, some from IATSE and some from some other filming groups and things of that nature. I'm not sure if Equity has come out with their guidance yet. I know they were working on it, but it's been a while since I've checked on that. That kind of exactly what you're talking about. Quarantining, and certain people in certain zones have to quarantine. There's a zone A, a zone B, and a zone C. And so there's certain levels of testing to be in each zone, and quarantine to be in each zone. I would say that if you are strictly following those rules, then that should be fine. But I would make sure that you have a copy of all of those rules that you're following, and contact the county health board. And understanding that if you're doing this with a live performance, that you're then opening up to a whole group of people that have not been following that quarantine. So you want to have that much more distance. To be clear on county health departments versus state. So the state puts out this guidance. They actually do not have a formal approval or questioning process, or really any, at the state level. I'm having these conversations to kind of mitigate confusion, and also to advocate for the sector. Each county's health department is responsible for understanding the guidance, or for implementing the guidance. That being said, they don't always read it as carefully as I do, or as you might. So you want to know your guidance, right? Like their health departments will be like, well, you're over the maximum gathering, so you can't do it. And you'd be like, well, no, see right here, Executive Order 195, Section 5, 5, mass gatherings. I'm covered under 3.2, so you can't cover me under mass, right? So that's why it's important to know. But if you're looking to have some kind of filming, you obviously have a plan. You're going through a procedure that involves regular testing, distancing, quarantining, pods. You can present that. You can say, this is what I'm doing to the county. And then that way they're aware of it. Also, just to be clear, we want to stay, there are not a whole lot of instances in the state where there have been roving police forces of people trying to crack down on people breaking these restrictions. Because as long as that you are reasonably following the intent of them, and that you are doing everything, then it's not obvious, right? So obviously, if there's a bar that is playing loud music and crammed to over capacity, police are going to stop that, and they're going to cite them for being in violation. But they might not necessarily do hard head counts of a bar that looks like they at 25 or 35% capacity right now. So I think a reasonable expectation of following the rules is a good rule of thumb.
Okay, and here's another one. In phase 3, the gathering restrictions is based on the activity and not the venue. So if a performance is 30%, then what would be the percentage for the wedding reception? Would it follow restaurant guidelines? 50% no, since everyone is seated and eating?
The wedding reception would fall under 3.8, movie theaters, meeting spaces, and entertainment facilities. So that's sort of where your conference centers, event venues would fall under that. I mean, though understanding if you're serving food at that wedding, then you're going to also need to follow all of the guidelines for restaurants, but your capacity for an event venue is going to be 30%, even though your capacity for a restaurant is 50%. There's a lot of inequity in the guidelines. I think the I don't think that there is anybody that hasn't already recognized that there was some inequities, particularly when we rolled this out, that there was, it was May and we had 50% of where restaurants opening at 50% and bars staying closed. But breweries open at 50%, right? Like there were some inequities, or movie theaters at one level and theaters. So the inequities are getting better, but you're still going to be running up against a few inequities. Honestly, I think that if you are legitimately seating people and legitimately keeping people at a 6-foot distance between groups, you probably aren't at 50%. You're at 30% at the highest. And so that's how the wedding in an event space should be held, with everybody seated and no dancing.
Okay, I think we've answered all the questions. And we're about at the right time too.
All right. Oh, look at that. Fantastic. Well,
wait,
everybody.
Here's one more. Okay. Oh. Nope, never mind. She said thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, everybody, thank you so very much for making the time. I hope that this is helpful. This is going to be posted on our COVID-19 training videos section. If you're at our COVID-19 Resource and Action Center Hub, there's a big button for the training videos, as well as from the advocacy drop-down menu, where you can find this and a whole bunch of other webinars that we've done on everything from federal relief, taxes, fundraising, advocacy, federal relief programs, et cetera. So thank you so much for making us a part of your day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.